Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us today on today's webinar. My name is Paul Dabbar. I'm a Distinguished Visiting Fellow here at the Center on Global Energy Policy at Columbia University and was formerly Undersecretary for Science of the Department of Energy. Welcome to the Columbia Energy Tech Revolution Forum. Many energy technologies 20 years ago had not been invented that are currently deployed and being deployed and are now very prevalent technologies, such as solar, wind, lithium-ion batteries, and advanced drilling. Much of the current dialogue of current energy policymakers focus on existing technology, but this forum will instead focus on what's next in emerging technologies. Today, we're going to discuss the future of beyond lithium-ion batteries as a second part in this multi-part series on the evolving energy technology revolution. Let me quickly say this event is being webcast live, and the full video will be available online in the coming days. For those of you joining via Zoom, you can submit a question for the panelists at any time by clicking the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. So why is this topic so timely? Lithium-ion batteries have been a great American invention and have been successfully deployed in a very wide amount of uses, including personal electronics, cars, and utility scale power systems. But there are many chemistry innovators that have been working on what's next. What types of new battery chemistries can improve over 75% above the current performance metrics of today's lithium ion? But much of the clean energy policy community has little exposure to the current state of play of these beyond lithium-ion battery possibilities. Today, we're going to focus on the prospects of these advances to making a difference to the energy transition and inform the broader energy policy community of these prospects and what additional policies and funding would accelerate these prospects. This second session of the Columbia Energy Tech Forum is co-hosted by the Columbia Electrochemical Energy Center and will include a welcome by Dr. Dan Steigart, the Stanley Thompson Associate Professor of Chemical Metallurgy and co-director of the center here at Columbia. It is an honor to be a colleague of Dan's at Columbia. This session will feature two leaders of large efforts to develop new battery chemistries that are beyond the current lithium-ion technologies. Dr. Esther Takaguchi, chair of the Interdisciplinary Science Department at Brookhaven National Lab and distinguished professor of chemistry at SUNY Stony Brook, is a leader in the multidisciplinary field of energy storage technology and holds more than 180 patents. She will be joined by Dr. George Crabtree, director of the Joint Center for Energy Storage Research at Argonne National Lab and the University of Illinois at Chicago, one of the leading next-generation battery research hubs in the world. It was an honor to be a colleague of both Esther and George for many years at DOE International Labs, at Brookhaven, and at Argonne. So welcome to everyone here. I will now pass along for some comments to Dan.
Great. Thank you, Paul. And it's a real honor to be here with both Esther and George, who are heroes and colleagues, but mostly heroes. It is wonderful to be colleagues with Paul and everyone at CGEP. Let me tell you a little bit about where I'm coming from. At Columbia, I co-direct the Columbia Electrochemical Energy Center along with Professor Alan West and Dr. Jeff Fitz, including Jeff and Alan and myself. We're 11 strong, and we cover everything technically from atomistic simulations and surface analysis all the way to systems analysis, including extraction, refining, and recycling. And the goal of the center is to accelerate the adoption of energy storage. I say accelerate. A decade ago, the question was, can we even scale energy storage? Is this even possible? And as Paul mentioned, what we've seen in the last decade is an incredible amount of technological growth and initial adoption as well as a pull, as well as the push of climate change. So this has been largely on the back of the lithium-ion battery. And as Paul mentioned, the question is, how do we go forward from the lithium-ion battery? And so the way I see it, we have to, before we get into what the technology is, we have to balance what it needs to do. We have to discuss what it needs to do. And I think it has to do 5 things in order to be better than lithium ion. And it might not have to do all of these 5 things at once. And I argue maybe that's impossible. But the first thing it has to do is cost less than lithium ion battery. Not cost less than lithium ion battery now, but less than the asymptotic cost of a lithium ion battery. My research has pegged this to be somewhere between $40 and $50 per kilowatt hour, and recent estimates from Tesla, Bloomberg, and MIT put it at about that range as well. So in order for a technology to be beyond lithium ion in terms of cost, it has to be less than $40 or $50 per kilowatt hour. The second aspect, and I think it's the most exciting scientific aspect to study, is lifetime. How long can a battery last? And this is really important. People like to point at the laws of thermodynamics and say, well, entropy says this is why batteries can't last forever. And that's simply not true. The second law of thermodynamics dictates efficiency, but it doesn't dictate lifetime. And I'm happy to get into this in the conversation. The third is energy density. Can we fly a plane a long distance that carries people with batteries? Can we move a ship across the ocean? This is going to be really tough. The periodic table says that we have about a factor of 10 compared to lithium-ion batteries now, and engineering reality probably puts it at 3 to 5. Then there's power density. How fast can we charge the battery? I'm not sure that we're going to be much faster than a lithium-ion battery is now. So can we match it? And can we get to a point where we can recharge a car in, say, 5 minutes, so that we're on refueling parity with petrol? And then finally, and perhaps most important, is can we do all this safety? Power plus energy plus localization plus low cost generally equals a bomb, and we certainly don't want our energy storage to blow up. So as we think about aspects of beyond lithium ion, we have to make sure that the zeroth order condition of safety is satisfied. And I know both Esther and George have been working hard on all of these at their respective centers. So I'm really psyched to hear what they're going to have to say today. So on to you both. Thank you.
Dan, thank you very much. Esther, would you like to give your introductory comments?
Thank you very much. I just want to say it's such a pleasure to be here today with Dan, George, and to Paul Dabbar, a special thank you for organizing and moderating this very important and I think very timely subject regarding energy storage, specifically electrochemical energy storage. Batteries are really an enabling technology in that they're really intimately linked to the application. And this is echoing what Dan said, we need to understand what it needs to do. And if we think about batteries that have been successful commercially and really deployed widespread, the reason that they've succeeded is because they meet the application needs better than anything else. So a few examples to highlight that. Lead acid batteries have been around for over 100 years. So it's an old technology, yet virtually every internal combustion car uses a lead acid battery. So there's millions of them around and they're still used today. It meets that need more effectively than anything else. Second example from my own personal background, I spent many years developing batteries for medical applications. So again, very special needs set, long life, very compact size that was necessary, incredible reliability, that safety feature. But in that application, quite frankly, there's a little bit more flexibility on cost than some other applications. And then let's flip to lithium ion, which, of course, surrounds us today. Who doesn't have multiple lithium ion batteries on their desk today, and everything from phones to laptops to other things. They were developed for and meet the need of portable electronics really in an excellent way. And I think the message that I'm trying to give is, will there be one ultimate battery that meets all needs? And my own opinion is no, there won't. The need sets are different. That balance of factors that batteries need to meet changes depending upon what the application is. So I think we will have different batteries for different applications. And I don't think that's bad. I think that just says that battery is a very broad umbrella that can encompass a lot of technologies. So sticking with lithium ion for just a minute, there are still challenges, even though lithium ion is pretty dominant. If we think about the electric vehicle arena, fast charge is still a real challenge. The drive for higher energy content is important, either to allow cars to drive further or just make the batteries smaller. Technologically, other things that are critical are wide temperature range. Abuse resistance and safety is still a critical consideration. Kind of widening the parameter window of how the batteries can function, both in terms of voltage and current. And we're working, I think lithium ion is a technology that's going to continue to be around for a long time. So we're working on all of those things. But let's think also about beyond lithium ion. I think one of the arenas that's really driving, it's not the only one, but one of the arenas that's driving beyond lithium ion is the need for very large scale storage, where the cost becomes extremely important, as well as the lifetime, because then if you've got a large installed battery, how long it's going to last becomes an important economic consideration for the installation and kind of the lifetime cost of the installation. Also, ideas such as thinking about more environmentally abundant, more environmentally friendly materials, aqueous electrolytes, to really minimize the chemical footprint as well as drive lower costs. So those are certainly things that motivate beyond lithium ion. So the final point I want to make is the rate of change that we as technologists are trying to execute over the next 5 to 10 years. To achieve the transformation of the energy landscape that's on the agenda is going to require a rate of change that in many ways is totally unprecedented. And if we look back at the history of how long it takes to introduce batteries, it's a long time. New batteries take a long time to introduce. But I have a lot of optimism. And one of the reasons of optimism that I have is that we have new methods and tools available to us today that really only 5, 10 years ago did not exist. And let me talk about 3 specific definitions, because I think they're very important to understand. One is called ex situ. So what that means is we test a battery under various conditions, then we cut it apart, take out the parts, and analyze them and hope that nothing's changed. The next is in situ, where we try to do measurements before we cut apart the battery. But the profound development over the last, like I said, several years, has been what we call operando. And there are a variety of methods that can be used, but we study batteries while they're actually working. So the reason this is so critical is that we can gain information quickly about what the reaction is, what the mechanism is, spatially, where is it located, what's the limiting ion flow, time frame. We can measure directly the kinetics of the reactions by monitoring the batteries. And by having this information at our fingertips, we can eliminate so much of the historical, let's say, trial and error of moving battery technology forward, where we can, through understanding and deliberate probing of these mechanisms, we can, in a very deliberate way, design the next generation of technologies to accomplish the specific goals that we're trying to accomplish. So I do have a lot of optimism. It will take investment, but I think we're well positioned.
Okay, Esther, thank you very much. I'm going to be asking a follow-up question on those tools for speed of innovation, which is an excellent point, which I'm not certain many people understand. There's been a big change on that. So let's make certain we do a follow-up on that during the question process. And then finally, George from Argonne National Lab, please go ahead and give your introductory comments on this topic today.
Thanks, Paul. What a pleasure to be here. Let me echo what Esther said. I think it's a hugely important topic, and Paul and Dan, we really appreciate your continued involvement. It's going to take years, decades to get where we want to go, and it's a wonderful challenge to have. I would like to echo things that everyone, Paul, Dan, and Esther have said, and that is how the battery landscape, the energy storage landscape, has changed in the last 30 years. And that's about the time that lithium ion has been around. I'm sure people who are old enough remember that when it first came out, it was for a camcorder that Sony wanted to sell, and the battery was too heavy to make it personal. Lithium ion solved that. It was basically a business decision that Sony made. And that triggered a huge, really, the last 30 years of personal electronics, where lithium ion is really the very best fit you could imagine. It does everything you'd like it to do. About 10 years ago, we started thinking, well, why not have electric vehicles? We looked around for a battery and we said, there's lithium ion. Can that do the job? And remarkably, we're now finding that yes, it can. It can not only power your cell phone, it can power your car. And your car requires a battery that is roughly 10,000 times bigger than the battery in your cell phone. And although there are some challenges, fast charging is one of them, and there are a few others, some of which have been mentioned. Actually, Dan mentioned safety, which I think is a much bigger problem for personal cars than it is for cell phones and laptops. But it looks like it will work. And as Paul mentioned, 4 years ago, there were hardly any lithium-ion batteries deployed in the grid. Now they're being deployed at a fantastic rate. And in a moment, I want to turn to how fast in the future we have to deploy them, which is maybe 4 or 5 times faster than we're doing it now. But it's amazing that the same battery could accommodate all of these uses. The battery that you need for the grid is something like 1,000 or 10,000 times bigger than the battery you need for your car. So I think ordinarily you would not have expected the same battery to do all those uses. And Esther touched on a point that I'd like to make too in a couple of minutes, and that is the diversity of batteries that we're going to need for our next big challenge. And our next big challenge is very clear. It's climate change, and especially decarbonization and energy storage, and batteries play a huge role there. This challenge has a timescale on it. So unlike other timescales, which were basically whenever it's ready, we'll make the change. This we have to get done by 2035 or 2050. And that is maybe one of the biggest challenges that we faced. In fact, my opinion, climate change and decarbonization will be one of the signature challenges of this century. So there was a report that came out last May from the International Energy Agency, which for the first time had a scenario for the entire world to decarbonize by 2050. And it was a little bit shocking at how fast we have to deploy wind, solar, and storage, and how many things, how many sectors we have to decarbonize. And in fact, a point made by that report and echoed by DOE is that we don't have all the technology that we need to achieve decarbonization on any time scale. For personal cars, it looks like the lithium-ion battery and its very incremental improvements will do the job. We might like to have a faster charging battery. We might like to have a safer battery. We might like to have a cheaper battery. But those are all nice to haves, not must haves. However, the CO2 emitted by the transportation industry, about half of it comes from personal cars. The other half, as Dan mentioned, are long-haul trucking, rail, marine shipping, aviation, and it's pretty clear that the lithium-ion battery will not be suitable for all of those. It may work for some. Aviation, as Dan pointed out, is maybe the biggest challenge. And you may need a battery that has 2 or 3 times the energy density of lithium-ion for that. So that's an applications need that we don't have a battery for. Another one in the grid is long duration or many day storage to stabilize against consecutive cloudy or calm days, which you might expect to be, you might expect them to be powered by wind or solar, which simply because of weather events won't be there. And we don't have a battery that can do that. So lithium ion can discharge for about 4 hours. If you need up to possibly 10 days, 10 consecutive days of cloudy or calm weather, we're going to have to look for another solution. And I should point out, and we may want to discuss this a bit later, that there are other options other than batteries. One of them is chemical storage and green hydrogen that comes without the production of carbon dioxide. Could be, it's actually a very exciting opportunity, pretty much undeveloped. And that's a storage medium that we really should look at. So I liked all of the talk earlier from Esther and Dan and Paul about applications driving the battery development. And I would like to point out, in addition to what Esther said, something that is happening now and that I think will be, it's on the R&D side and will be very, very important going forward. And that is understanding battery phenomena at the atomic and molecular level. So if we had that complete understanding, we could then design a battery atom by atom, molecule by molecule, where every atom and every molecule plays a prescribed role in producing the targeted overall behavior that we want. Let it be long lifetime, let it be fast charging, let it be high energy density. And that is something that J. Caesar is working on. It's actually been its mantra ever since the beginning, which was 8.5 years ago. And we have about 1.5 years to go with our 10-year term. But our overall goal has been to exactly that, to understand energy storage phenomena at the atomic and molecular level. And if we can do that, I think it would be a big step forward to meeting the challenge of getting all the decarbonization technologies, including things like chemical storage, by 2050 or by 2035. So with that, I think I'll conclude. And Paul, I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Okay, great. So Esther, Dan, go ahead and turn back on your cameras. So we're all on board here. So I'll start with the first question. Obviously, storage is the hottest topic, I would argue, in energy tech over the last decade, starting with the Prius and now Tesla being worth $1 trillion in market cap. And George, as you were mentioning, utility scale now being an everyday deployment for utilities, from it being a concept less than 4 years ago. All of this was based on lithium ion. Obviously, the Columbia program here, a lot of it's based on policies, right, and programs and what works and recommendations. So from your perspective, what were the basic discovery and innovation support funding policies, programs that made the lithium ion revolution so successful? Esther or George or Dan, go ahead.
I can jump in if you like, Paul.
Yeah.
And I think it's really interesting to look at after 1991, of course, then the battery was used for the Sony camcorder. What were the developments? And actually, in the early, 2-3 years, it was mostly on the anode side. We didn't have graphite as the anode. We had other forms of carbon. And it was a question of how to make rechargeability, that is persistent rechargeability for hundreds or thousands of cycles, work. Finally, after a couple of years, we converged on graphite. and a particular liquid organic electrolyte that would be ethylene carbonate. And remarkably, a very similar and very common electrolyte before that was propylene carbonate, which simply didn't work. It exfoliated the graphite and the anode failed. So after a couple of years, that we converged on that, and then we started to turn to the cathode. At that time, it was always lithium cobalt oxide. We began to put other transition metals in for the cobalt, namely nickel and manganese. And that really accounted for the increases in energy density. I mean, at that time, I don't think there was a driving force like we have now, that is climate change and decarbonization. And so it was mostly just industrial development that took place, but it was a lot of R&D, and maybe R&D that you couldn't have foreseen and couldn't have developed a policy for.
So let me jump on George's comments, and thank you for those comments, George. I think the Department of Energy really did play a key role here, and especially in the early days of providing funding for lithium-ion investigations. I was involved in the battery field when Sony made the announcement about lithium-ion, and I can tell you, it turned the battery field on its head. At that time, there was a lot of investigation on rechargeable lithium, but it was rechargeable lithium metal. And in fact, there were companies that were formed. The two that come to my mind are Mali Energy in Canada, Tataran in Israel, that released lithium metal rechargeable batteries and commercialized them. The problem was that over time, the safety was not there. Now, here's the interesting compromise that Sony did. The lithium-ion battery, especially when it was first released, before all of the improvements that George, so nicely described, the energy density was way lower. It was way lower. So it wasn't energy density that drove it. It was really the ability to have a 3-volt battery that had many cycles and that was safe. And it turned the battery industry on its head in about a year. I've never since seen such a rapid transformation, and the entire R&D landscape has happened in 1991, 1992. And it was the right thing to do. All of the developments really stemmed, from that initial launch by Sony Corporation.
So let me ask just kind of a follow on, Dan. You can jump in on this also here. What I thought, there's always something to be learned, like what could have been done better, right, from a policy point of view. If I heard properly, George, what you said, that and Esther, as you were kind of making reference to, there wasn't as much of a demand pull, right? And it wasn't until there was a demand pull trigger, right, Esther, as you were just kind of commenting to, if I was listening properly, what allowed it to jump forward / what would have been better, right? If there was a demand pull earlier, right, with a product, with a customer, in this case, you're both talking about Sony, that's maybe something we've learned. But are there any other things that we've learned that it's like, we didn't do it as well as we should have, so to speak, as a community, as a public policy, whether it's demand, maybe there were others. Are there any others or any other comments around what we learned from that process to try to, for the future batteries, what should we do differently?
So to jump in and amplify both George and Esther, I went out to grad school, drove from New York to California for grad school in 2000. And when I got in my car, I was supposed to go to Berkeley to work on a large lithium-ion bus battery. And then when I got to Berkeley, my advisor told me that the project had been canceled. Right, so 7 days later, the project had been canceled because it had been decided that a lithium-ion battery that big would be too unsafe and that it would catch fire. And this was the prevailing boogeyman at the time. And so there was a lot of focus, as Esther said, on making the cell chemistry safer, and the DOE BAT program policy focused on safety, which is absolutely strategically the right thing to do. What I would argue was the important tactical shift that a private industry implemented later, and this is Tesla, is that instead of making large format packs with an inherently unsafe chemistry, Tesla took sort of unsafe batteries. As George mentioned, these cells want to go off like firecrackers if you mistreat them, and cool the hell out of them so they'll never see that condition. And yes, it was a premium car, but the real innovation initial innovation of Tesla on the battery, as far as I'm concerned, was taking this commodity 18650, packaging in such a way that even if one of them went into thermal runaway, the heat propagation would not spread, and eventually you would get a little check engine light. I'm oversimplifying it, but that shift in what the battery should look like enabled then the engineering to what we see today, where you can have cells much more densely packed together. And so what I would argue that policies should look for is not so much disruption, but gradual slopes in which an existing solution can be put into a premium application or taxed as such or subsidized slightly, and then cost down through relentless engineering. Because as Esther said, that event in 1992 when Sony introduced lithium-ion battery was an overnight doubling of energy density and tripling of cycle life. If we ever see that again, that would be amazing. I'm not betting on it. What we've seen since is this beautiful learning curve on both energy density, cycle life, power density, and safety on all four of those things. And so in retrospect, a policy should look for these learning curves and look to accelerate these learning curves instead of betting on disruption. This is dangerous for me to say because I've been very well supported by ARPA-E, and I love ARPA-E because they look for these disruptions. And I think what ARPA-E has enabled is these micro disruptions to come in and help create this overall massive learning curve that's helped everybody. And so this balance of thinking about things differently, but looking at ways in which small disruptions can lead to evolutionary change. As my wife works in policy, and as she likes to say, policy is a blunt tool and it's a hammer, and so you should use it to smooth things out as opposed to radically disrupt things.
I can't resist, I'm sorry, I just can't resist, Dan, picking up on one statement that you made. For policy to determine that some technology will never work is not a good idea. Agreed.
Yep.
Yeah, I think as Esther, you were effectively saying it's hard to predict in an R&D portfolio exactly what's going to work or not. That's why it's basic research, and having a portfolio of projects. Not knowing which one's going to hit is probably a better idea, especially as you get further and further towards the discovery, the early side. So starting to talk a little bit, everyone has been talking about performance metrics, and obviously the goal of having new chemistries is not just to have fun with chemistry, which is fun, is definitely fun, but it's actually have performance metric gains. What sort of performance metrics, and I know different battery chemistries and so on, which I'll get into it here in a second, what are the more interesting ones in beyond lithium ion, but what sort of performance gains, pick whatever performance metrics you want to target, do you think are possible, and approximate ranges of improvement over lithium ion do you think is actually realistically possible? Because I think from a policy point of view, people go like, how much better can we go is an important policy question.
So I can jump in on that, Paul, and I know Esther and Dan will as well. But if you look at just the structure and the capabilities of lithium ion, you might put a lithium metal anode in, as Esther mentioned. That's been a goal for 40 years or more. We're getting closer to it. It's probably going to happen. That's my opinion. It might happen in the laboratory within 5 years, and that could mean another 5 years to get commercial. But you might go from around 250 or 275 watt hours per kilogram to 300 or 350. People don't think you'd get much higher than that. And that's kind of a fundamental limit for lithium ion. So if you want to go after the heavy duty transportation, where you need something like 800 watt hours per kilogram for regional aviation, you need a different chemistry. And this is where I think, to Dan's point, incremental improvement is really important. That's what happened to solar cells. That's what happened to wind turbines. That's what happened to lithium-ion batteries. You've got this 18650 cell. You want to make millions of them so you can mass produce them and just double the output, and the learning curve is that the cost goes down by somewhere between 10 and 20% every time you do that. It's a winner. That really is a winner. But if you're going to go after, let's say, aviation, you need a different battery, and so you do need some disruption along the way. And you might, Paul, I don't know if you want to get into this now, but lithium oxygen and lithium sulfur are two candidates that could, at least theoretically, deliver that. They would have to be innovated. They would have to be put on the commercial market in a small way, and you'd have to trust that learning curve to really bring the cost down.
Thank you, George. Let me pick up on this thread, because I was thinking a lot about the metrics. And as we push forward, as technologists, I think that with innovation, let me call it the better battery or the better mousetrap. I have not boldness, but I have confidence that we have highly talented, innovative people. The big challenges that I see, honestly, relate less to the metrics than they do to the economics, that the costs need to go down, the supply chains, and these are global supply chains, need to be there. The sheer number of batteries of all types that are going to need to be manufactured over the next 5 to 10 years are enormous. So even if we start with the technologies that we have today, how do we get there? How do we have supply chains? How do we have economics that work? How do we deliver the demand? And this becomes so critical globally, in terms of not only certainly in terms of economics, but even things like reliability, security, sustainability, especially if we're backing up the grid. So it's that translational piece that I think is also of critical importance and does need attention.
Yeah, Esther, just a comment. I think you raised a critical issue, the supply chain. If you look at the supply chain for lithium ion, it's pretty complicated. It's pretty international. And it's not clear that it will be able to supply the demand, especially if there's a surge that in a number of years, you might be able to meet, the supply chain might be able to meet that, but there could be shortages along the way. And I believe quite rightly that this inexpensive, earth-abundant domestic supply chain is a top priority for any next generation battery. As successful and wonderful as lithium ion is, we would like to do better on the supply chain next time around. And an example that comes to mind is one of the cathodes that is not being used very much now, but iron phosphate has a wonderfully simple supply chain. Everybody's got iron and phosphorus and oxygen. What could be simpler? So it meets all those requirements. It has a lower energy density. It has much greater safety because the thermal runaway temperature is higher. And a much lower cost. So although it's a cathode that 10 years ago was maybe more popular than it is now, it's coming back. And there are a lot of applications that just that very alternative to a simple supply chain makes a huge difference.
Let me take this string into the next question, which you started talking about. So for the three of you, what chemistries do you think are the higher probability chemistries you see today? And Esther, with your comment that you never can't see what's coming, take that quickly aside. Which ones from your research or what you're seeing from other people working on are likely will hit some sort of metric, whether it's cost, supply chain, performance metrics. You mentioned lithium ion phosphate, oxygen, lithium sulfur. There's a air iron battery. There's a bunch of them. But what are yours? What are your threes kind of upper end of things of chemistries that you from work that you're seeing have a higher likelihood of reaching some sort of efficacy for at least one of the use cases?
Yeah, so just to amplify George on that last point about iron phosphate, it's seen a beautiful turnaround in the last couple of years. And so the story of iron phosphate is now the stuff of legend, introduced in the mid-aughts as a premium power battery, now as a commodity energy system. And if I had had the foresight to have seen that coming, I would be a much wealthier man. Iron phosphate is becoming so popular now that I was looking at it as a grid storage battery, because the thought was, well, if high nickel systems are going to be pushed into automotive, and then there's going to be handoff to sulfur, iron phosphate may be underutilized. There's enough iron phosphate to do at the end of history, both grid, say under 10-hour support, and EVs, but in the next 5-10 years, I imagine now all of the iron phosphate, or most of it, will be going into automotive, given recent announcements by Tesla, and a shift back to iron phosphate in China. So this leaves a massive opening for grid scale storage for things that aren't lithium, simply because the supply chains will be constrained for EV. I want to make this clear. I don't think it's an abundance issue. I think it's an extraction and supply chain issue in the short term. And so to hit decarbonization goals on both the grid and transport, we need to have alternatives on the grid that aren't lithium ion. So there is a renewed push into sodium ion, and with the learnings from lithium ion, without, unfortunately, the premium cost that can be demanded initially, sodium ion is particularly interesting. We're seeing a resurgence in iron, which is beautiful, and iron has some challenges, but you can't beat it on cost. Something like 30 cents per pound on a fuel basis simply can't be beat. I think the big disruptor here would be reversible aluminum. On paper, if we can make aluminum without CO2 emissions, aluminum should be the anode at the end of history, because it has 3 electrons, it's minus 1.6 volts versus hydrogen, and it's the most abundant metal on Earth. So the big technological disruption would be production of aluminum without carbon emissions. Even if you use renewable energy the way aluminum is made now, you produce about a mole of CO2 for every mole of aluminum produced. So that would be huge and awesome. That's sort of my stretch goal. But if aluminum doesn't happen in the short term, it's going to be iron. And then the hard question, Paul, is there's enough elements and they're cheap. So I work a lot on zinc bromine. Zinc bromine is cheap, won't catch fire. But when I look at the amount of zinc bromine that's going to have to be extracted to meet demand, it's about 1,000 times, at least on a bromine basis, 1,000 times the bromine that's produced yearly now. We're going to have to produce going forward. There's enough of it, but building up that supply chain is a challenge. So I think zinc bromine can do it. We're going to be taxing the supply chain there, but I think we can do it. And I think iron has an incumbent advantage because we make enough of it already.
Just add a couple comments. That's really nice, Dan. The original concept for lithium ion was the idea of insertion materials. And so the idea is you think about the atomic structure looking like stacks of paper, right? And then ions kind of move in and out of these stacks of paper. The beautiful part of that is that the ions don't disrupt the structure very much. So they can have really high cycle life. And actually, mostly the ions can move pretty fast too. So we get power. But I think that the next breakthrough opportunities, I think, are for different mechanisms. So, and Dan mentioned a few, and I'll use the broad term of conversion, right? Where we start with one material and it turns into something else during the charge or discharge process, and then we try to reverse it back. And examples are, silicon, sulfur. We've done work on things like iron oxides, and these have much, much higher energy density than the lithium ion in the insertion manifestation. And then even more broadly speaking, from our own work in aqueous systems, there are things like dissolution deposition, where we're dissolving something and then redepositing it. And I think that as battery scientists, being open-minded and thinking not just beyond lithium ion, but beyond insertion materials can lead us into new horizons. And I'm personally very excited about some of those areas.
Great comments, Esther and Dan. Just a little addendum. There is a lot of work on lithium oxygen. At one time we thought, oh, you can't take the oxygen out of the air because you have to purify it, get rid of the CO2 and get rid of the moisture, as those things poison the reactions. But there is work in the last 3 years that shows indeed there are ways to take the oxygen out of the air and in the battery disable those unwanted side reactions. And to me, that's a big breakthrough. I think that's that makes lithium oxygen a lot more appealing. Another thing, again, part of the same group that it's a group at UIC actually, who did this work. They showed that you could use moly disulfide as both a catalyst to promote the lithium oxygen reaction and a storage device. As Esther said, you take one thing, oxygen and lithium, and turn it into something else, lithium oxide. This very interesting two-dimensional moly disulfide, the edge is the catalyst and the flat part is the storage medium. And that has a lot of promise. So I think at one time we thought lithium oxygen was maybe a little bit too hard, too big a goal to go after. I think it's coming back too. And as Dan has pointed out, it's these incremental improvements in how do you make it happen that are, if it does come to pass, that will eventually make it come to pass. I think those things are really, really impressive. And I really like iron oxygen. My goodness, it couldn't, from a supply chain point of view, nothing could be better. And that would kind of democratize battery production.
So let's talk about manufacturing. Obviously from a political point of view, money coming in from the American taxpayer supporting university research, lab research, public support's needed. Obviously, lithium ion was a great victory for the investment by the American taxpayer on the discovery side. It led to a Nobel Prize. The innovation that was driven that ended up at lithium ion from National Science Foundation and DOE were very impactful. And it made a big impact on the science and the discovery and the prospects. But as we all know, the manufacturing of that did not end up where that was discovered and the Nobel Prize was won. From a political point of view, when you're trying to ask for money for support, it's great to point out about those aspects I just described. But from a political point of view, they want to see more. They want to see that the investment by the American people also has an impact to local communities for jobs, and that's understandable and completely appropriate. So that didn't work out too well, right, from that fabrication point of view compared to where the discovery science was. How would you recommend as innovators and inventors in the space that as you work on the next set, right? How should the country, how should you or others structure programs so that it moves more slowly, so to speak, locally, right? It moves locally rather than internationally, and the U.S. taxpayer, kind of gets some more value out of that discovery science support. How would you think about the policies to try to make that more likely for the next chemistry?
Great question, Paul. And if you go back, and Esther will have a much better perspective on this than I will, and probably than Dan will, since she lived through it. But when lithium ion went overseas, there was not the sense among American business that they wanted to pick it up. And I think Sony had a particular application that it needed a battery like that. To them, it was a business decision. It solved the problem for them. As we've said before, it was an applications pull that brought the battery to life. Looking back, we can say we wish it had happened differently. But it's a cultural thing, and it is certainly a government thing. I think if you look at what's happening just in the last budget cycle, there's lots more incentives to keep the manufacturing of new battery products in the States. It's, to me, it's a movement in the right direction. It's not clear that the policies that are in place in the bill that was just passed by Congress will be the right ones. We'll have to try them, and over the years, maybe perfect them, evolve them, modify them to get the ones that really make it work. But it's cultural as well as just legal. It's certainly a question of incentives. And I think the question is to find the right incentives. We now understand the problem a lot better than we did in 1991.
Let me pick up on that. Market pull is certainly a big issue. I remember it was in the early 90s, it was certainly after the Sony announcement, finding lithium-ion batteries in the United States was really difficult. And I happened to go to a scientific conference in Japan in the mid-90s. And I went to an electronics store and just bought all the lithium-ion batteries I could find so I could take them back home and kind of test them and figure out how they work. So clearly, the market demand was not here. The manufacturing of portable electronics was not here. I think that one of the differences now is that this energy landscape need for batteries is here. We have utilities here. We have grids here. We have microgrids here. We have car manufacturing here. And the manufacturing for many of those things is local. And I think by having the application manufactured domestically, that is going to motivate making the batteries domestically as well. But if the application is not local, then thinking that we're going to make batteries here and ship them internationally, it's a harder thing to see. But I think the landscape is different for the types of applications that we're considering today.
Yeah, Esther, I like your point that we have car manufacturing, which we don't want to lose. Batteries are so heavy, it doesn't make sense to ship them over the ocean. You got to make them locally. And of course, that business acumen, everybody understands. The big car manufacturers are going to gigafactories one way or another. May seem a bit slow. Europe made the same decision, and they're maybe a little bit ahead of the States, but it's going to happen just because the business pull is there, not only the market pull, but the business pull.
And just to echo and amplify, what I've seen in the last 15 years is just the degree of automation has made it possible. So when I visited plants in Taiwan in the late aughts, there was a lot of touching along the entire chain and a lot of black art on how to cast the electrodes and stuff like this. And now you go into a plant and it's completely automated. And so it's an interesting ping pong effect because yes, we exported technology that was invented in the United States and it was scaled and learned up in East Asia. And then in East Asia, as labor costs went up and need went up for more cells, automation increased. The automation that was then scaled in East Asia is now being re-imported into the US and Europe. So it's surprising to me that it hasn't happened with solar yet, and the fact that it looks like it's going to happen with batteries before it happens with solar is an interesting thing. I think George's point on the mass is crucial. Batteries are much heavier than solar panels are and harder to ship, so that probably has a lot to do with it. I just want to link this to recycling. There's a lot of discussion in the Q&A on recycling, and what's going to be really interesting is the fact that at a certain point, you can imagine this economy going pretty circular. And at that point, materials of origin from around the world will now be localized in given markets. And the cost of recycling will soon become a premium of mineral extraction, as in the US will soon be have massive reserves of both cobalt and nickel in its batteries, and keeping those internal to the US, I think, will be of a strategic imperative.
But before I shift to Q&A, and I'll shift to first question on recycling, and now it's, as you said, there's been a lot of Q&A asked on that. Before I would like to make one really interesting comment to what you all just said. I think is really important from a broader energy policy point of view. Esther, you and George in particular just said, it's a demand pull, right? And if there's a demand pull, then some of these technologies can be finalized and optimized and scaled and so on, as I heard you say. There's a big debate right now in the energy sector, and it's kind of a broader topic, even outside of batteries, about supply versus demand. And there's been a lot of debate about that. And it's gone back and forth over the last 10, 15 years about what's politically possible in terms of supply versus demand. But a lot of people have been recently attacking supply, right? Like, let's go shut this down and let's go build this instead. And it's interesting because as you watch that, even right now, there's a tremendous amount of turmoil around this topic, around supply, and about regulation on supply and introduction of new technologies in supply. But it's hard to sell a product if you make the supply, but you don't have a customer to buy X, whatever X is. And so that's a big debate, I think, in the energy sector overall about whether we should be just pushing new supply of the topic, or should we be incentivizing demand, or having clients or customers or companies or people who want the product. And I just find it fascinating that you all said, if we had demand, right, that's actually important, right? Because if people wanted more electric vehicles or whatever, it would probably incentivize everything that we're talking about right here even more as a demand pull for that topic. And I can say that personally for some of my other things I'm working on outside of energy. So I can see that directly. So now let's go to the Q&A. As Dan was mentioning, there's a lot of questions about recycling. This gets into the waste and environmental impact of waste. It gets into supply chain and materials. It's becoming quite topical in a lot of Q&A. So I'd like to have the panelists address that. So what are your thoughts about both technologically, the chemistries and the prospects for the different ways of recycling, and where do you think the industry is? Back to almost Esther's point here, we're like, is there a demand pull? Is there a demand pull for recycling, or does something else need to happen in order for those chemistry prospects to be able to compete, so to speak, in the market?
That's a really...
Go ahead, George. Go ahead. You start and I'll pick up on it.
I was going to make a simple comment, and that is, we actually don't have a lot of lithium-ion batteries ready for recycling, because the big surge in EV, which is where the market is, hasn't happened yet. It'll happen in a few years. But lithium-ion batteries, they last 8 years, maybe longer, maybe 10. Don't think we're quite sure how long they'll last in cars. And it was only 10 years ago that the very first roadsters were introduced. So we just don't have the supply of batteries. And it's possible that R&D will develop the next generation of batteries, which might be significantly different from lithium ion, before this generation of lithium ion batteries becomes available to recycle. But everyone's point, Dan, Paul, yours, and Esther's, that we have to recycle, and it's a huge resource. It really alleviates a lot of the supply chain worries if you recycle all the materials in batteries. We have to do that. And I think one of others can comment, Esther and Dan, better than I can, but I don't think we have the technology to recycle lithium-ion batteries yet. It's just not economic. Lead acid, wow, that's a superb recycling story. We need to get to that place with whatever battery technology becomes dominant, either for the grid or for transportation.
So,
go ahead.
no, I mean, yeah, so I think that it's a complete pull function on both the amount of batteries and the eventual minimum economic grade. Once we have a lot of 10-year-old, 5 to 10-year-old lithium-ion battery packs at 50 to 100 kilowatt hours per pack, the aspiring entrepreneur will say, that is a nickel mine of a massive economic grade. Same with cobalt. There's a catch-22 with something like iron phosphate because the iron phosphate is dirt, and so to recycle that, there has to be a good reason to do it. And you know, one of my former postdocs in her PhD with Jay Whitaker, Rebecca Ches, she's now a professor at Purdue, wrote a beautiful paper a few years ago on just this point. So I think that clever entrepreneurs see this coming. Redwood Materials has built up quite a war chest to get this done. I think that the metals will be easy, right? It's solvent easy in quotes. There's a lot of work that has to go into it, but solvent extraction and hydrometallurgy are well-proven industries. The carbon and the organics and what you do with those at the end of their life is a trickier thing, because repurposing organics, repurposing polymers, repurposing graphite is still has massive scientific hurdles.
The comment that I was going to add was really to echo, you know, what Dan and George said, that the need is going to be there, but it's not there yet. The other thing is that the technology for recycling isn't available, partly also related to how the cells are designed. They're not designed at all with recycling in mind. You know, I believe that there are ways to not only recycle the elements, but conceptually to reuse, repurpose, you know, rejuvenate, you know, major components of the batteries, but the batteries aren't designed that way. I mean, part of the reason that lead acid is such a wonderful success is it's plastic and lead. You know, you melt down the lead, you get it out of there and build your new battery. And I think the statistics are amazing. I think it's like 98% of lead acid batteries are recycled, but partly it's because they're designed to be. And lithium ion historically has not. And as the fundamental materials become cheaper and cheaper and cheaper, as they should, you know, to drive costs down, then it's going to become partly an economic question about what is worth recycling. You know, is it really the lithium that we're trying to save? Is everything else in there? I mean, for example, if we have a lithium sulfur battery, surely we don't want to recover the sulfur. So I think it's really an ongoing question, but one thing is for sure, as we progress towards the reinvention of the energy landscape, if we don't do something, we are going to be building mountains of old batteries, mountains.
So there's several questions in here also about utility scale, flow batteries, vanadium, you know, organics. What's the likely chemistry to that, beyond lithium ion chemistry for utility scale that could hit those sort of metrics, such as how many hours of discharge and possible, and whereas some other metrics are less important, for utility scale. So what are the chemistries you think have a higher likelihood for those beyond lithium ion utility scale applications?
Well, just jumping in if I can, and I know Esther and Dan will have comments as well, but I do think we haven't talked about flow batteries yet today, and they are in fact designed for the grid. They're almost a perfect match in the sense that you can get all the capacity you want, all the energy storage capacity, just by making a liquid tank bigger. And you don't have to worry about ions migrating through the anode or the cathode. It's a liquid, you just pump it. So the costs go down, and already that's a big advantage for liquid organic flow batteries. And the sort of white space for molecules you could discover that would have properties you like for grid storage is much bigger. The classic flow batteries, there are many out there, but take vanadium, it's probably the oldest commercial one. Vanadium, very interesting transition metal. It's quite limited in what it can do, although it can change its electronic state by several electrons. That's pretty impressive. But take an organic material, and for example, a carbon ring. You can hang many pendant molecules off each one of the carbons, 6 carbons in the ring. They don't have to be the same, a different pendant molecule on each carbon. You can get multi-electron transfer. You can adjust the solubility. You can adjust the cost, the lifetime. You can even perhaps make a new organic molecule self-repairing. So one of the pendant molecules becomes defective. You can cut that bond and add another one, replace it with a fresh one, in a way that you could never do with almost any other battery. So this is one of the things that J. Caesar happens to be working on. It's a ways off, but it's a real opportunity. And I think those things need to be looked at carefully.
My view is that whatever it is to hit the cost targets that DOE has set forward, and they've certainly set forward very aggressive cost targets in terms of watt hours per kilogram. It's hard for me to believe that the electrolyte is going to be anything other than water. It's going to be water with some kind of salt in it, some kind of other thing. It is still a pretty wide open landscape. There are many, many competing technologies, and I think there will be for the foreseeable future. Whether it will ultimately consolidate to one technology, maybe not. Maybe there will be several competing technologies that remain on the landscape. But I think cost, scalability, safety, lifetime, those are going to be the determinants of what is successful. So I think aqueous electrolyte water-based batteries is absolutely a key.
The one, I guess, controversial point I'll push out. I mentioned this in a energy storage workshop virtually at Cyndia a couple of weeks ago. Flow batteries on paper are beautiful because they're unit operations and you can maintain them and they look like chemical engineering flow charts. However, the closed form systems, lithium ion battery in particular, have pushed down their operating expense, their OPEX, so low that it's made it hard for flow batteries to compete. And so this is what we've seen over the last decade. The rough metric you use to figure out whether or not a battery should be used on the grid or not is you take its capital cost and you divide it by how many times you can use it in 10 years. That's a huge overestimate, but it's a great ballpark figure. If that number is too expensive, you can't use the battery on the grid. If that number looks okay, then you have to go through and add many more factors. And so you want that number, the capital cost of the system divided by how many times you can cycle it in 10 years, to be less than 10 cents. And lithium ion got there because of learnings in EV, right? It's purely empirical, purely empirical. It's not to say that flow batteries can't get there, but in addition to the wonderful chemistry research and new couples that Jay Caesar is studying, I implore the DOE to look at learnings on OpEx for scaled systems. And I know that there's a new DOE AMO call program that's looking on this, but this has to happen to make flow batteries as competitive as they should be, because I think they can get there, but the learning curves have just not been as kind to them as they have lithium ion.
If I can make a tiny comment, I agree, Esther and Dan, with both of you. And I would say that especially organic flow batteries, and Esther, your point, water-based flow batteries are certainly cheaper, and a very interesting techno-economic study that came out when 2014 showed that they can be competitive. The liquid organic has a higher voltage, the water battery has a lower cost. And there are places where one or the other of those factors is more important. But the point I wanted to make is that it would be a breakthrough and then a learning curve. And it took 10 years for lithium ion and solar panels to come down to the cost where they are. That could easily happen if there's enough demand and production for, say, a flow battery. So I agree with your points. It's a major concern, but I wouldn't rule it out.
Well, thank you, everyone. The one question that we're at the end point here of time that I was going to ask next, but I think is just highly topical for us to just everyone listening to think about, is just a proliferation of startup companies that have worked with the likes of everyone here and funded by DOE elsewhere, like QuantumScape and Form Energy, that are the number of unicorns, aka over $1 billion worth of value. Certainly, some of those are well north of $1 billion that were supported and funded either out of Argonne or supported by ARPA-E in its early rounds, like QuantumScape, have really proliferated heavily. And those are great success stories. And the question is how do you move on from that to the next steps in terms of structure? But thank you again for all the panelists here for participating today, and for everyone who's tuned in. There will be a video recording of this event that will be available on the Columbia Center on Global Energy Policy website the next few days. Our full calendar of upcoming events was actually in the chat, or you can find on the webpage for all the other events that we're doing at Columbia on energy policy going forward. In the final session of this semester's Columbia Energy Tech Revolution Forum will be in December, discussing wind technologies and policies with the top two builders of wind over the last 20 years. So hopefully that'll be interesting to have their perspective of the wind industry, technologies and policies. We hope you enjoy the rest of your day and look forward to seeing you soon. Thank you, everyone.